There are plenty of seats down here in the front. And I understand we'll have a good chance for question and answer at the end of our lecture, so keep that in mind as you're selecting your seat. I'm Ruth Berggren. I'm the director of the Center for Medical Humanities and Ethics, and welcome to Conversations about Ethics. This presentation this evening is actually the 13th installment in our series, which explores the ethical dilemmas that influence healthcare throughout the life cycle, beginning, middle, and end of life. Always present decision-making challenges, and that's what these conversations are meant to address. We do present this series twice a year in partnership with the Ecumenical Center, with our center here at the UT Health Science Center, through the generous support of Methodist Healthcare Ministries. Would anybody who is here representing Methodist Healthcare Ministries or the Ecumenical Center please stand for a moment and be recognized so we can thank you. Thank you. All right, so a few brief housekeeping details if you will indulge me. Dr. Paul Root Wolpe and the Planning Committee have disclosed no relevant financial relationships with any commercial interests related to this activity. If you are seeking continuing education credit, I've got to hold this up, please be sure to sign in at the appropriate desk according to your professional affiliation. And that is the record of your attendance. And those who are seeking continuing medical education credit will need to log on to our CME website, it's cme.uthsc.edu, a month from now, and click on post-conference to claim your credit. And all of this information is on the record of attendance form that you should have received, and which if you didn't, you can get one on your way out. Don't give this form back to us. It's for your information to connect you to your CME. All right. For continuing nursing education credit, you must complete the evaluation certificates, and they will be mailed within 2 weeks. For CEU credit, fill out the survey provided at the sign-in and return it to the CEU desk before you leave, and you will receive a certificate at that time. If you're unsure about any of all of this, we have wonderful volunteers at the back who will be glad to answer your questions. Now, for everyone here tonight, we really value your feedback, and we would ask you to thoughtfully evaluate this evening's program. We'll email an evaluation form to you after the presentation, or you may use the QR code or link which is on the back of your program that you have in your hand now. Tonight's presentation is titled, Is My Mind Mine? Neuroscience, Privacy, and the Self. It has long been taken for granted that a person's innermost thoughts are private. But now, neuroimaging techniques are challenging this assumption. This is a relatively new discipline of neuroethics, which confronts the ethical, social, and legal implications of this new era. And our speaker, Dr. Paul Root Wolpe, is considered a founder of neuroethics. Dr. Wolpe is the Asa Griggs Candler Professor of Bioethics, the Raymond Shinazi Distinguished Research Professor of Jewish Bioethics, and the director of the Emory University Center for Ethics. His work focuses on the social, religious, and ideological impact of biotechnology on the human condition. He is co-editor of the American Journal of Bioethics, which is the premier scholarly journal in bioethics, and he sits on editorial boards of more than a dozen professional journals. Dr. Wolpe is a frequent contributor and commentator in broadcast and print media. He has a recorded TED Talk. He was profiled in the Atlantic magazine as a brave thinker of 2011, and he is the senior bioethicist for NASA. Please help me welcome Dr. Paul Root Wolpe.
Thanks so much. Well, it's a really great pleasure for me to be here, and I want to thank everybody who invited me and has been so gracious in hosting me. It's been just a pleasure since I got here. So what I want to do tonight, I was asked to talk about neuroscience, and though I am going to give a significant part of the talk to the question in the title, I'm also going to talk generally about this field of neuroethics and some of the kinds of interesting questions that it raises. I'm not going to give you a lot of answers. I'm not sure there are a lot of answers yet. But I really actually believe that it's everyone's responsibility to think about these questions. Because the kind of impact that neuroscientific findings are going to affect everybody. And believe me, I know all the bioethicists. You don't want to leave it up to us. I know these people. So let's move right along and talk about what this field is. The economist way back in 2002 said, if asked to guess which group of scientists is most likely to be responsible one day for overturning the essential nature of humanity, most people might suggest geneticists. In fact, neurotechnology poses a greater threat, and also a more immediate one. Moreover, it's a challenge that is largely ignored by regulators and the public. Now, notice what's interesting about this is that they think of genetics and neurotechnology as a threat. They didn't, for example, say they have great promise. And there is that idea that these kinds of biotechnologies pose a threat because they are changing, or at least challenging, the essential nature of how we think about ourselves and neurologically, where we put so much of our sense of identity. So neuroethics is a new field. These are definitions of it. One I wrote way back in 2003, one that Mike Gazzaniga, the cognitive neuroscience, wrote about 2007 or 8 in his book, The Ethical Brain. And I think what neuroethics actually is some combination of these two things. That is, on one hand, it really is an examination of neurotechnologies. A lot of the questions that we raise about neuroscience right now are about brain imaging and deep brain stimulation and psychopharmaceuticals, and we're going to talk about all of those. But on the other hand, it raises a whole series of conceptual and social and psychological and philosophical questions. I talked a lot about those questions at lunch today for those of you who were there. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to focus a little bit more on the technologies this evening. So there are different ways to frame these issues. We could talk about the ethical issues that neuroscience raises, questions like privacy, which we are going to talk about, altering function, brain enhancement. So that's one way. We could give a whole talk just using that as our conceptual schema. Or we could do it through the neurotechnologies, which is actually pretty much what I'm going to do tonight. Or we can do it through brain approaches. There are different ways to think about the brain, diagnostically, conceptually, for neuroscientists, for clinicians. Or we can do it through findings, which is a little bit also what I did, and we'll do a little bit tonight in lunch today. And that is, neuroscience has had some findings that have challenged the way we think about ourselves as human beings and the way we think about our brain. And I'm going to talk about agency and free will in a moment. So let's start with that idea, challenging ideologies and belief. And I'm going to do this very briefly, but there are some fundamental concepts that neuroscience has been challenging. First is the sense of agency. There actually was a MacArthur-funded 3-4-year project on neuroscience and the law, because one of the places where neuroscience has become most problematic is in forensics. That is, what do brain scans mean in the courtroom? Recently, the American Society for Neuroradiology had a consensus conference at our center. What was happening was lawyers would have a client that was guilty, accused of some terrible crime, and they'd throw them in the brain scanner hoping that the scan would find something that looked like an anomaly in their brain so that they could use that as a potential mitigating factor. And the American Society for Neuroradiology began to get very concerned because their members were being called as expert witnesses, and the American Society for Neuroradiology didn't like what their members were saying, because very often what they were saying actually wasn't supported by the science. So we did a consensus conference. We called in people from all sides, and we helped write the Society for Neuroradiology's standards now for their members testifying in court. But that's just a microcosm of what's happening in courtrooms right now as neuroscience has begun more and more to understand functional states of the brain that might affect people's sense of agency, even to the point where some of them are arguing in the work, especially by Libet on free will that actually we don't have agency in the way in which we think we have it at all. So Benjamin Libet's experiment, which has become very famous, was an experiment basically where he asked people to engage in an action. It was just a small act of moving their finger. And he asked them to determine through a mechanism, a clock, when they decided to move their finger. Sounds simple enough. But he was imaging their brain while they did it. And what he discovered was that their brain activated 400 milliseconds before they said they decided to move their finger. And there have been a number of studies since. And what he decided that meant was, and what many others have argued, is that we actually make no decisions at all consciously. We think we do, but our brain makes a decision pre-consciously, informs our conscious mind of what it is, and we think of that as having made a conscious decision. So it's a very complex and very elaborate conversation going on about this, but there is a whole area of neuroscience that suggests that we have no real agency, that is conscious agency, and that we have no free will. That in fact our brains are making decisions and operating in some sense on their own and informing us, and we interpret that as having made a conscious decision. And as I mentioned, one of the things that has been argued is once that conscious decision comes to mind, once our brain informs us of that conscious decision, we can decide not to do it. So some people have argued we don't have free will, we only have free won't. Very famously, Phineas Gage was a man who had an iron bar shot through his head, through his left eye and out the back of his head, where it lodged, and he lived. He was a railroad worker who was tamping down some dynamite, and it blew this thing through his head. And the reason he has become so important as a symbol is because they didn't understand up until then that how much of who we are, personality, memory, disposition, even things like love and attachment, were connected to the structure of the brain. What that bar did was give Phineas Gage basically an instant lobotomy. And he changed completely from a very kind of responsible family man into a profligate, couldn't hold a job, had real memory problems, and he changed completely into a different kind of person, which started people asking the question, so is there really no me outside this, few pounds of mush between my ears that determines everything I am? Right now, many people kind of take that for granted, that everything that I am is encapsulated in my brain, but back then they didn't think that. They thought that a lot of what I was due to my soul, and so you could mess my brain up all you wanted and I'd still be me. And what Phineas Gage did was he really began to make people question that. I don't know how many of you have read about it or heard about it, but now they're talking about doing head transplants. And some of you are shaking your head. So they've done it on mice, a number of them in China. But let's think about that as a philosophical conundrum for a moment, okay? So, if you take my head off and you put it on another human being, who is that human being? It's a very interesting question because we assume for a minute in our culture that that human being is going to be me. It's going to have my memories and my thoughts, and we'll consider my wife its wife and my kids its kids, and so it will be me just with a different body. But we actually don't know that. We actually don't know that. First of all, we've got enormous systems enormous nervous systems outside of the brain. We've got an extraordinary complex set of nerves in the gut which create their own nervous system that probably has its own kind of intelligence. Maybe I won't just be me. Maybe I'll actually be some hybrid of me and the person whose body my head now inhabits. We actually don't know the answer to that question. We're very cerebrocentric, but other cultures are not. So for example, in Japan, the seat of personhood is thoracic. It's in the gut. And that's why Japanese have such trouble with cadaveric transplants, with transplants from cadavers. Because in order to do a transplant, you have to keep a cadaver alive. That is, you have to keep the blood flowing to its organs, you have to keep it oxygenated. Well, to Japanese traditional thought, if the organs in your chest and stomach are alive and operating, you are alive. In fact, your personality is alive, even if you are brain dead, whatever that means in the West. The idea of a thoracic personality is why the Japanese commit seppuku. They cut, when they want to commit suicide, they disembowel themselves. They don't cut their heads off. And they do that because that is the seat of personhood in Japanese traditional thought. And it affects them. So let's say for a minute, what if they're right? And what if so much of who we are and what we are is actually not cerebral but thoracic? Then maybe when we transplant that head onto another person, we are not creating a new me. We are actually creating some kind of a hybrid between me and that other person. We're going to really know from mice. Right? We're actually not going to know it even from monkeys. We won't know it until we try it on human beings, if in fact we do. And of course, the most basic question is that of consciousness, an issue that we still don't understand. William James, I read this quote earlier today, but William James in 1902 asked the question, and I put it up here to show you that it is an old question and one we're still struggling with. And in this quote, he basically says, you know, those of us who think about religious experience, we get really upset when people say to us that we are someday going to be able to understand all of this biologically, because our experience of having religious experience is not one that we experience as something reducible to biology. It is something really so much more profound to us than that. And that's why we feel outraged and hurt, for we know that, whatever our peculiarities, our mental status have their own substantive value as revelations of the living truth. In 1902, we were trying to understand the relation between our biological, our physiology and our biological functioning and the things that we experience, and we still are. It hasn't changed. So, what I want to do now is go through a few of our technologies and talk about what the ethical challenges are, and then spend a little time focusing on the one that has to do with privacy, which is brain imaging. So I'm going to talk a little bit about psychopharm, then we're going to talk about brain imaging and privacy, and then very briefly I'm going to talk about brain-computer interfaces and neural nets and electrical simulations. These are two others that have some important ethical questions, but we just don't have time, so I'm going to skip those two. So let's start with psychopharmacology and neuroenhancement. So we're already very much manipulating and micromanaging the chemical of our brains through using these technologies. We have, we certainly have therapeutics. We have things that we take because they're prescribed. But then we also have all these whole categories of other ones that now have names like cogniceuticals and moodiceuticals and sensiceuticals, which are drugs that actually change various aspects of who we are. Pretty soon, and these drugs are getting more and more sophisticated and more specific. So it probably won't be too long before we micromanage our mood, our affective and cognitive states throughout the day. We'll wake up in the morning and we'll take our sort of wake. We can do our work, and then we'll have our lunch, and we'll take some pill that'll keep us from having that postprandial depression that you get about 2 or 3, where in most other cultures they take a siesta, but we're too stubborn to actually do that. So we just fall asleep at our desks, and then, at the end of the day on the way home, we'll pop Sublime, the drug that makes you want to see your family again. I don't know, but that kind of thing is not as far-fetched as it sounds. We take more psychopharmaceuticals in the United States than any other country by far. We take more drugs than any other country except for one. Does anybody know who beats us? Germany. Germany takes more drugs than we do, but they take less psychopharmaceuticals than we do. And we worry about it more than any other country. We take them and feel very guilty taking them, but we take them. And now we're beginning to think in a different way about them. So let's talk about some of them. So what about the amphetamine salts, the drugs which Ritalin and Adderall are, that are stimulants that we have taken for many, many, many years for attention deficit disorder and other things like that. And now we have modafinil and other drugs like modafinil, which are unlike Ritalin and Adderall, are not amphetamines. Modafinil is an attention-enhancing drug that is not a systemic exciter. It doesn't do what amphetamines do. There's a lot of question about these drugs. You know, one of the things we have to understand, a lot of drug taking is a function not of disease and infirmity, but of society's interpretation of disease and infirmity. Right? So attention deficit disorder, for example, is an adaptive trait in a hunting population, but it's maladaptive in a society where you're asking an 8-year-old kid to sit for 7 hours in a chair. Now, one might argue that, in fact, we're the ones who are maladaptive by asking a 7-year-old kid to sit for 7 hours in a chair. And that the kinds of behaviors that he demonstrates that were evolved over, you know, thousands of years of hunting and gathering are actually, would be fine if we had a different environment. We fit into an environment and we define disease within an environment either as adaptive or maladaptive. But now we've got these drugs like modafinil that have no amphetamine, that aren't amphetamines and have no systemic effect like amphetamines. And the question now becomes, what about those drugs? They seem to be very safe drugs. Should we take them? Should we start taking them recreationally or for particular purposes? In fact, here's an interesting question about that. Should it be required? Should it be required? So, they took some pilots, they put them in flight simulators, they gave some modafinil analog, and they gave others a placebo, and then they threw flight emergencies at them in the simulator. And the fascinating thing was, not only did the pilots who were on modafinil respond more quickly to the emergency, they responded more appropriately. Now, if you actually could prove that that was true in a number of follow-up studies, and now I gave you a choice to be on a plane with a pilot that took modafinil or one that didn't, what would you choose? And what about your surgeon and your bus driver and your train driver and anyone else who has a responsibility of human beings at, you know, in their hands and needs to be attentive in order to execute that? So maybe we should start saying some of our professionals should be forced to take modafinil. And in fact, what about in the workplace? What if I take modafinil and I get more productive because I'm taking it and you sit next to me? In fact, that was a question that they asked Wired magazine. One of my coworkers, a rising star at the firm, is using unprescribed modafinil to work crazy hours. Our boss started getting on my case for not being as productive. Should I tell him about, should I snitch on him or should I take modafinil myself? Right? So maybe pretty soon everybody's going to be taking modafinil because if you, or some other drug like that, because if you don't take it, you're not going to be competitive in the workplace. Or what about memory? First, let's talk about memory suppression. So propranolol and other beta blockers are now being used in memory suppression therapeutically for people with PTSD. What's interesting about it is people think that we now have drugs that can suppress memory. We actually don't. It's more complicated than that. It's more interesting than that. One of the things that we kind of know but might not realize we know is that emotion cements memory. Right? So if I'm walking along in the woods and the lion jumps out at me, right, that emotional trauma is evolutionarily designed to make me remember that lions live here. Right? On the other hand, when I sit for 4 hours at the Department of Motor Vehicles staring at the ceiling tiles waiting for them to call my number, there's no particular reason why I remember that. Right? And I don't, right? We do things for hours and hours that we have no real memory of, but if someone at the Department of Motor Vehicles started screaming all of a sudden or had an epileptic fit in front of me, I'd remember that, right? So when emotional valence is tied into memory. What propranolol actually does is when you evoke the memory, so in PTSD, someone, so the lion jumps out at me, I have this acute fear response, and over time, that fear response is supposed to extinguish. I'm supposed to remember where the lion lives, But every time I walk by there for the next 30 years, I'm not supposed to collapse in a heap of fear, right? But what PTSD is in failure to uncouple the memory from the acute emotional response. And what propranolol does is it decouples that connection, and it allows the memory to extinguish in a normal way, or at least that's the theory of it. But the point is that it's not about memory suppression. It doesn't suppress a memory. It decouples insofar as it works, and it's still all experimental. But the point is that we do not yet have a way to suppress memory like in some movies that have come out, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and others, that suggests that someday we might. But what we really might have very soon is the opposite. This is Eric Kandel, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering how memories are encoded in neurons. And he is the CEO of Memory Pharmaceuticals, which is trying to develop a memory pill, presumably for Alzheimer's and other memory deficits. But I'm going to tell you something. Considering how many kids are on Adderall and Ritalin who do not have a diagnosis of ADD, where it's used either, there's a bimodal distribution of diagnosis of ADD. It's more common in inner cities, and it's more common in wealthy suburbs, and it dips in sort of the middle-class suburbs. The difference is in the wealthy suburbs, it's the parents pushing the diagnosis, while in the inner cities, it's school management pushing the diagnosis, right? School officials to use it as management. So the point is that in the wealthy suburbs, if Johnny, it's like a Johnny Cochran poem. If Johnny gets a B, he must have ADD, right? If my kid got a B, he must have ADD. I'll take him to the doctor, get some Ritalin into him, and maybe. Now I'm not talking. Ritalin is a good drug for those who are actually have ADD and are diagnosed. I'm not speaking against that. I'm talking about its overuse in many places. Well, just imagine what happens when the memory enhancement pill comes out, right? How many parents in those wealthy and in all kinds of schools, especially if it turns out to boost memory and be fairly benign? I have myself at the age of 58 what is called by physicians as normal middle-age forgetting, right? It looks something like this. I was just talking to, it looks like that. You can recognize it very quickly. If there was a safe, effective memory enhancement pill where I would immediately remember my best friend's name, I might be tempted, and I'm sure a lot of you would too. And then there's trust inducers like oxytocin. That's Larry Young, one of the premier researchers on oxytocin. Really interesting set of questions. Oxytocin seems to enhance trust. And when they do these experiments where they give people oxytocin and then they play these psychological trust games, there is a significant difference between people who take oxytocin and those who don't in terms of their willingness to trust others. So it raises a lot of interesting questions. And by the way, you can go on the web right now and supposedly get oxytocin cologne that you're supposed to put on and then try to, get the woman that you're dating will then trust you more. There's a real problem with that, though. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. First of all, there's no oxytocin in any of that. Oxytocin is really expensive. You're not going to get it on the web for $9. But it doesn't even make sense because I put it on and I'm breathing it in all day. She might breathe it in for a minute or two, but I'm going to start trusting everybody. No, it makes no sense. Anyway, so oxytocin, though, if it does work that way, and there's a lot of experiments, there's some interesting questions. So we have a paranoid schizophrenic. It's someone who believes that everyone's after him. He doesn't trust his doctors. Is it ethical to give him some oxytocin if we can show that that would increase his trust? What about in kids on the autistic spectrum who have social bonding issues? Would it be ethical to give it to them and try to increase their social bonding issues? I mean, these are really interesting questions that we're going to have to ask ourselves. And it might end up being an effective drug if my wife and I go into marital counseling, just, little intranasal spritz of oxytocin before we go in, and, might break down some of those distrust barriers that got us into counseling in the first place. I'm not trying to change you, I'm trying to enhance you. So, pretty soon we may have the tools to do that. And people are using it. This is already 2007, okay? So this is 8 years ago. Nature magazine did a question of the people who read it, how many of them use enhancement technologies, and 20% or so were using unprescribed enhancement drugs, and now the rate is much, much higher. In addition, we're talking about, there are all kinds of conferences, human enhancement, nanotechnology, exploring human enhancement, the Sharp Brain Summit. There are all kinds of conferences now talking about using these technologies, a lot of articles. Here's one that these two I was involved in writing, and John Chatterjee is a neurologist who invented the term cosmetic neurology, arguing that pretty soon people are going to go to neurologists and just ask for a series of enhancement type drugs to increase their neurological functioning. So here's the very set of interesting questions about enhancement around psychopharm. Let's move on to brain imaging. So, my thoughts, they roam freely. Who can ever guess them? Well, the answer is right now we're beginning to be able to guess them, not just guess them, know them. Something actually fundamentally different is happening. You know, in ethics, we don't usually get things that are fundamentally new. We get new versions of questions that we've asked for centuries. My argument is that we're about to enter a fundamentally new situation that we've never had before in human history. And what is that? For all of human history, without any single exception in the whole history of humanity, any information you got from me, any meaningful information, you got through my peripheral nervous system, through language, through gesture, through me blushing or sweating or my eyes dilating or whatever it is, whether you were looking at me or whether you were using a polygraph or whatever it was all through the peripheral nervous system. You couldn't get any meaningful information at all through my central nervous system, through my brain, and let's forget the spinal cord for now. But directly from my brain, you couldn't get any information at all. They tried. We had phrenology, we had craniometry. These were supposedly science trying to use the shape of the brain or the size of the brain to get meaningful information for people. And of course, how many phrenologists and craniometrists do you know? Right? They weren't all that successful. But now, for the first time in human history, and I'm going to try to show this to you quickly, we are actually developing the ability to get subjective information directly from your brain. I'm going to have to prove that to you, which I will hopefully won't in a minute. But assuming for a minute that I can prove it to you, the big question is, does it make a difference? And there are people that say fundamentally it doesn't, and I say fundamentally it does. First, very quickly, let me prove this to you. Kamatani and Tong showed that they could brain image someone while that person was looking at images, and they could tell whether the person was looking at checkers or spots, whether they were looking at stripes. Now, and that work was done 8 or 9, 10 years ago. We've gotten to the point now where they can tell, they can give you 20 faces, have you look at one, brain image you, and tell which face you're looking at, or which movie scene you're looking at. Turhan Canley showed that the size of the cingulate gyrus was correlated, part of the brain, correlated with extroversion and introversion. So by looking at the size of that, they can, in general, not in any particular individual, it's an aggregate thing. So people with larger ones tend to be more extroverted. But no particular individual can we tell that about. Here's the fascinating one. Liz Phelps did this extraordinary study. She took white males and black males, and she put them in first she gave them this test, a well understood and validated test of innate racist ideology, right? It doesn't mean you are a racist or that you're prejudiced against others. It means that your thought processes involve racist thinking. So she had a score of racist ideology for each person in her study. Then she put them in a scanner, and she flashed in front of them pictures of known and unknown white and black males. So known black male faces like celebrities and sports stars and politicians, and then white faces, and then just random white and black faces. And what she discovered was a correlation, strong correlation, between racist ideation as measured on that scale, and activation of the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that evokes fear and anxiety and discomfort, in white males when they viewed non-familiar black faces. Now, when you think about it, it makes little sense. If I have some discomfort with African Americans, especially African American males, and you show, Chris Rock or someone, I might not feel anxiety, but then if you start to show, faces I'm not familiar with, I might show that anxiety. But here's the point. And she hates when I say this, Liz Phelps does, because no one's ever done the study. But can we actually reverse engineer that? That is, can I know nothing about you, put you in a scanner, flash some pictures of unfamiliar faces of another race? By the way, the same thing was not true in the black males. That is, their racist ideation was not correlated with amygdala activation in unfamiliar white faces. But could I do it and say, aha, this person has racist ideation? I'll show you. You see, when they look at black male faces, their amygdala activates. That means I could know something extraordinary about you, having never asked you a question, knowing nothing about you, just getting it directly from your brain. We've never been able to do anything like that before in history. Green, with moral judgment, I went over this at lunch in great detail, but he created brain imaged people when they were doing a philosophical problem called the trolley car problem, and he found that, in fact, different parts of the brain light up when we present different kinds of moral problems. And he's the one that then postulated that we actually make moral decisions in two different ways. We make rational moral decisions, and we make emotional moral decisions. One, we make impersonal moral decisions very rationally. We make personal moral decisions emotionally, and sometimes those two are in great conflict. So he discovered ways that we make decisions. Price and Zafiro were involved in finding the part of the brain that's specific to reading and no other language. So why is that important? Let's say I go out to the field of battle and there are our enemies, and we capture somebody. Because I'm not a member of the enemy. I don't even speak the language. I don't read the language. Don't know anything about it. And then I'm not speaking to you anymore. Theoretically, we could put them in front of a scanner. We could look at the part of the brain that's the reading part of the brain, and we could flash up words in different languages, and then when we get to the target language, we can see whether the reading center lights up, because you cannot look at a word in a language that you can read and not read it. It's instantaneous. I can't say, don't read this, flash cat up there and have all of you go, okay, I saw it, but I have no idea what it is. Adrian Raines, violent offenders and brain structure, has shown that he believes there's strong correlation between certain brain states and violent offense. I'm going to start going fast. John Dylan Haynes did a thing where he asked people to decide whether they were going to add or subtract some numbers, brain image them, and predicted with 80% accuracy what they were going to do, so he could understand what their future decision was based on differential brain states. Dressler and Chish, this is an amazing study. They found intentional dreamers, right? These are people who can go to sleep and control their dreams. They are conscious and volitional in their dream states. And so he asked them, they call them lucid dreamers is the technical name, and he asked them at some point to raise their right hand and clench it. And they brain imaged them, and at precisely that moment, there was activation of the motor cortex. And their hand didn't clench because we have sleep paralysis, right? Sleep paralysis keeps our body from doing what we're dreaming it's doing. But in fact, the motor cortex, the very part of the brain that would light up if they actually clenched their hand, lit up at exactly the moment that they were intentionally doing that in their dreams. And then finally, from Case Western, not Case Western, Carnegie, Marcel Joost and Tom Mitchell did this study, incredible study, predicting human brain activity associated with the meaning of nouns. I wish I had an hour to talk to you about this study. But basically what they did was they had a computer look at a trillion, can't find it, oh, here it is, data from a trillion word text corpus. So this computer examined trillion words of text to find out how nouns were used. So broccoli, what are all the words that are ever used in the English language associated with broccoli? So green, vegetable, whatever it is, right? And so the computer learned what kinds of things we think about in relation to nouns. Then they picked 50 nouns or so, and they would give 58 of the nouns, 60 nouns I think it was, 58 of the nouns to someone and brain image them. Then they'd say, okay, they'd pick 2 more nouns at random, and they'd say, this is what his brain is going to look like for the noun bicycle. Based on the other 58 nouns that we looked at, we know exactly what the pattern of activation of his brain is going to be in bicycle, and in fact, they were extraordinarily right. They presented a computational model that predicts the fMRI neural activation associated for words for which the data isn't available. That is, they don't know. They don't have any data that that's what your brain is going to look like. They've never imaged you when you thought of a bicycle. But they had enormous predictive ability to decide. So, what's all of this about? This is about our ability now to begin to apprehend subjective thought. And it doesn't end with just words or ideas. It also involves brain imaging lie detectors, of which we now have a number. This is No Lie MRI. I don't know who named that company. The technology used by No Lie MRI represents the first and only direct measure of truth verification and lie detection in human history. Cephos is the only company licensed to perform brain-based lie detection. They actually don't do it anymore at Cephos. We now have a Pentagon technology with a new kind of voice lie detector used by the U.S. military. But it doesn't work. But the point is we are now exploring brain imaging-based lie detection. And in fact, it is, seems to be not effective enough to be used, but more effective than polygraphy. Mark George and Frank Kozel of South Carolina, very famous neuroscientists, said, okay, if we can actually determine what part of the brain activates when you lie, then we could take this little thing called a TMS wand, transcranial magnetic stimulation. And what a TMS wand does is it sends pulses into the brain and disinhibits, turns off the part of the brain that's right under it. And it's used for a variety of things. But they put in a patent that said the following. If determined that this part of the brain, for example, activates when you lie, then what if we put a TMS wand over it, turn it on, deactivate that part of the brain, and then the individual will be unable to deceive. So not only might we have a lie detection device, we also might have a lie prevention device. All of this leads to a really interesting question of neuroprivacy. Are we getting to a point where we're going to have to start worrying about technologies that will intervene in the brain in such a way as to reveal private information that I actually don't want revealed? That may be where we are going, and in fact there's a lot of evidence right now that that's where a lot of people are trying to go. My thoughts are my most private and personal part of me. It is, in fact, what makes me me, my memories, my beliefs, my way of thinking. It's far more precious to me than my DNA. People are so worried about their genetic privacy. Forget it. You can have my DNA. Many people have already published, people like Craig Venter and James Watson, very famous scientists, have published their entire genome. You can go get it because they realize there's not much you can do with it. But what if you could actually intervene in my brain? Don Kennedy, former editor of Science, said, I already don't want my employer insurance company to know my genome as to my brainome, a word he made up. I don't want anyone to know it for any purpose. So, the bottom line is the question of whether our thoughts are our own and how we should think about the issue of privacy. The Bar Association of New York asked that question. What are the legal implications of brain imaging? Are your thoughts your own? I have been advocating for a while that we should designate the skull as a zone of absolute human privacy. That is, even with a court order, a court should not have the right to force me to reveal the contents of my mind. Now, we can't do that yet. Don't run out of here and say, you know, Paul just said that they can read our minds. Not yet. I mean, it's still very elaborate. And here's the really important caveat. You can't brain image someone against their will. They have to lie very still in a brain imager. They have to think about what you're asking them to think about and do it. All right? So if you don't want to do it, there are lots of ways to beat it. But you know, there may be reasons why people feel coerced or very much that they need to do it, especially in certain kinds of situations, certain kinds of legal situations. Okay, I'm going to race now because we're running out of time and I'm going long. So I wanted to say a word about brain-computer interfaces. That's an Asian cockroach with a set of electrodes that allow people to control its movement. Laboratory. They also do it with rats. That's the Ratbot by Sanjeev Talwar, where they can actually make this Ratbot go and send it around a track by using a reward. They zap, they put electrodes in its brain so it feels like someone is touching its right or its left whisker, and when it turns that way, it gets a nice zap reward. And so they've trained it to move around a track. Miguel Nicolelis trained these owl monkeys who had electrodes in their brains to move prosthetic arms, to the point that these monkeys could begin to move prosthetic arms with their brain entirely independently, making them the first animals in history to have, first primates, to have 3 functional independent arms. Ways in which we are beginning to extend our reach in biotechnology and neurotechnologies in new ways. Then we have augmented cognition. These are caps that take your brain waves and translate them onto screens, so that pretty soon people are going to be working at computers eventually without caps at all. The computer will be able to begin to apprehend brain waves in other ways, but right now people who are quadriplegics and others can begin to use these technologies even right now. Or if you want, wearing a headset containing both EEG and NIRS sensors, a man uses a brain-machine interface to control a robot only in Japan. Would you find this thing? But this guy can actually control this robot just by thinking, using the EEG waves and near-infrared spectroscopy to control this robot. So we are actually entering the age. We're going to begin to control mechanisms. We're going to begin to control the things around us, our computers, our homes, our refrigerators and ovens, simply by thinking, I'd like the oven to turn on now. I'm going to skip that and go say one word about brain-to-brain and then conclude so that we have a few minutes to talk. Then a study was recently done, extraordinary study, brain-to-brain study for the first time. What happened in this study, and we've written a paper on this if you're interested on the ethics of this question. So this is the encoder rat, and the encoder rat is presses when a particular light goes on, they press a button and get a treat, and when the other light goes on, they don't get a treat. So they trained this rat to learn how to do that. Then they connected this rat's brain to that rat's brain, and they found that that rat much better than, so if they weren't connected, know what the lights meant, what to press or anything, and would just press randomly trying to get treats. Once they connected them up, this rat's guesses became far better than chance. That is, this rat's brain was sending signals to that rat's brain indicating which lever to press when the lights came on. So they showed that there can be brain-to-brain translation. Then, believe it or not, they did human brain to rat transmission. They did it very differently than that. They had an anesthetized rat. They had a guy wearing one of those hoods like you saw with augmented cognition, and his EEG brainwaves would then be sent over to the rat, and when he saw a particular signal, the rat's tail would start to wag, and only when he saw that signal. And then the ultimate goal is to try to see if they can create brain-to-brain communication so that using some kind of technology where where you're wearing something that connects to the outside of your head, not just like a cap, and I'm wearing one, I can actually send a thought to you non-verbally entirely through the function of my brain. That is not as far away as you think. That is something that we have the preliminary technologies for. And then finally, the last thing is brain stimulation. We now have different ways to try to stimulate the brains for Parkinson's and for depression, but what's important to know about that is that that TMS one I showed you can do a lot of these things without having to implant things physically. And now what's happening is companies like Neuronics, this website is not intended for use in the USA because Neuronics isn't allowed to sell anything in the USA, treating you a breakthrough in the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, where they actually used transcranial magnetic stimulation to argue that if you put it in this particular place, it'll improve your memory or do other things. I think it's completely bogus, and I think it's problematic. But the point is that these technologies are not just in the laboratories. If you start to look on the web, you're going to begin to, you already can see all kinds of neurotechnologies being sold to the general public, and you can just go out and buy yourself one of these machines from Neuronics. As you can see, they're small and inexpensive. So, in conclusion, I've just given you sort of this whirlwind tour through a lot of different technologies, and the idea here was not to scare you, though I think some of this is a little bit scary. The idea was to say we are marching ahead in neurotechnology in ways that I think people in the public have no idea about. And there are decision moments that are made. There will be a decision moment about when we start using lie detection technology in the courtroom, or whether you're going to be able to, come home to your dented car and have two teenagers, both who claim they didn't do it, and drag them off to no-lie MRI to see which one actually dented your car. We have these technologies. When we have technologies, we tend to use them. And the question we need to ask ourselves is this. Do we have an absolute right to privacy, or are our brains just the last frontier where the state has some right to go in there? I have colleagues in ethics, in law, who say to me basically, it's no different than anything else. They have, with the proper protections under court order, the state should be allowed to order a brain scan of you if they think that that's the thing that will solve the case. It's a very long, complicated discussion. There have now been many, many articles on this, but it's a really interesting question. How are we going to think about privacy here? And there will come a point at which the Supreme Court of the United States is going to have to make a decision about whether these kinds of technologies are going to be allowed to be used in the courtroom or not. Who gets to use them? Do you get to use them when your kids dent the car? Do the schools get to use them? Does the bank get to say, if you want to work as a teller here, I need to know you're honest, so we need to do a brain scan? Is that going to, we already allow lie detection in certain federal agencies. Are we going to start using brain scans in those agencies? Who has the power to use it? What about covert use? There actually are some technologies now trying to be able to brain scan, not in the sense of an fMRI, but using things like ultraviolet light that may be able at some point in the future to be used covertly, not just overtly. And who's going to make the decisions about this? Is it all going to go through the courts? I got to tell you something. Judges don't understand the first thing about neuroscience, right? Are we going to leave it up to them to make these kinds of decisions? And they shouldn't, right? And then finally, what are these going to say to us about the nature of selfhood and the changing view of who we are as human beings with all these questions about the nature of selfhood in the brain? So I'm going to leave you with the single most important takeaway, which is the same one I left everybody with at lunch today. In diagnosing and manipulating the brain, we've been doing it for many, many, many years. We've been doing it for over a century. And our record on it is dismal. Throughout history, we have made mistake after mistake after mistake. Why? Because underlying our view of what a well-functioning brain is a whole set of moral and social assumptions about how people should behave. And those change over time. And that's why when you have an example like this of the prefrontal lobotomies that were done by Joe Freeman, over 10,000 of them in the United States for the most trivial of reasons, but because they thought that these would help create a lot of them on young people between 15 and 25 who were in trouble, and they thought a lobotomy would just straighten them right out. We tend to project our moral, social values onto medicine and then suggest that we're being objective. What are, 100 years from now, when they look back at 2015, what are they going to say? How could they possibly have believed that? How could they have been so immoral as to think that that was a good thing to do? We have to be really, really cautious about these technologies. Ethics has to have some relationship to where science goes. And that's part of why I do what I do, and I hope that I've given you something to think about. Thanks for your attention. So we have a couple minutes?
Yes, we have a few minutes for questions.
All right.
There are microphones on either side of
Oh,
the
so-
hall, and there are people, a woman in the microphone. So if you have a question, raise your hand, please, so we can see, and someone will bring you a microphone.
Should what? Watch dogs. Well, I mean, bioethicists do all of those things. So here's the thing about bioethics. I'm a sociologist. Many bioethicists are philosophers or theologians. Sociology gives me no disciplinary way to make a normative decision. That is, sociology is not a normative discipline. It doesn't say what should or should not be. It's a descriptive discipline. It says what is, right? So I actually, though everyone calls me a bioethicist, I have to call myself a bioethicist. I'm actually not a bioethicist. I'm a sociologist of bioethics, which is different. Philosophers and theologians are bioethicists in the sense that philosophers believe they have a system that what the right thing to do is, and religious people from religious traditions believe they have a faith tradition that lets them know what the right thing to do is. But as a sociologist, I can't pull from sociology to say, do this rather than that. I do it, but my point is that when I make a normative judgment, I usually try to say I'm making this normative judgment with no more authority to make it than you have, except for the fact that I've studied it a lot more than you do, so I know more about it, but I don't have. So bioethicists are all of those things. They're advisors. They're, I write articles in which I say, I've really examined this issue, so you should take me seriously when I say I think we should do this, but you can certainly disagree with me about it. They tend to be watchdogs sometimes, people like Carl Elliott, who has been for the last 10 years in a fight with the University of Minnesota, where he works over what he thinks are unethical activities they did in human subject experimentation. There are bioethicists who've been extraordinarily courageous and were fired from their jobs because they took moral stances on bioethics. So bioethicists do all those things. But the thing I am absolutely firmly that I believe in is that while bioethicists may serve as consultants and advisors on this, it's not up to bioethicists and should not be up to bioethicists to make these kinds of decisions. These are decisions that affect everybody in society. And the reason I come out and talk about this stuff is because everybody needs to think about this. It's going to have profound impacts on our lives moving into the future. And so all of us need to be part of the decision-making process. Don't be shy. No, that's not exactly what I said. So if you want to implant something in your brain, if you want to voluntarily go and get fMRI, if you're accused of a crime and you're innocent, and somehow fMRI could prove that you were innocent, and you go and you say, I want to get this brain scan to prove I'm innocent, that's all great. What I'm saying is the state should not be allowed to coerce you to get any invasive brain technology. Very different thing than saying they should never be used, right? If you want to go do that, be my guest. It's your brain. But the state should not be able to force you to get a brain scan. That I have a profound belief in personal privacy, and there is nothing more, if there's any privacy that, of all the possible privacies we have, that we should guard, it is my right to own my own private thoughts without your ability to intervene in there and get them. Jean-Paul Sartre said that the greatest human capacity, the final and ultimate human capacity, is the capacity to say no. No, I will not tell you whatever it is I won't tell you. No, I will not cooperate. But if you can coerce, if you can go in my brain and get that information, I've lost the most profound right I have as a human being to resist something, and that is to not cooperate with you and not tell you what I don't want to tell you. This was taken for granted throughout all of human history. My private thoughts were private, and there was no way anyone could ever get them out of me. If we can now get them out of me, that is what I mean by saying it is qualitatively different. It will be the first time in human history that we could do that. Torture doesn't work. Truth serums don't work. None of that stuff works. But this could work. So it could be the first time in human history that we could force people to reveal things that lived in their private imaginations. And I think that that is a profound, that is the single most profound violation of personal privacy.
Word freedom,
Absolutely.
but that's not why that's not what I was going to ask you. Somebody was in Science Times a couple of weeks ago that there is no way, biologically or any other way, that the soul could exist.
Right.
Would you address that?
So Steve Pinker, one of the most famous public intellectuals we have, wrote about that very famously in his book, The Soul in the Machine. And I talk about that, I do a whole section on that in my classes. I think they're absolutely right. Biologically, the soul probably doesn't exist. But whoever said the soul was biological? There's absolutely no way to prove biologically the existence or non-existence of the soul. It's a metaphysical postulation. So all they can ever say is, we've looked and looked and looked and haven't found it, which is basically what Steve Pinker said. The other thing he says, which is a little subtler than that, he says there is no human quality that we know of that historically was attributed to the soul because we couldn't figure out how human beings could express it. His argument was there is none of those qualities that we now can't explain biologically. Nonsense. It's completely nonsense. There are lots and lots and lots of things about, we can't explain consciousness biologically. We have 150 theories, but every theory is flawed, and you speak to one person, will tell you everything wrong with that person's theory, and that person will tell you everything. We have absolutely no idea what consciousness is or how the brain generates it. And to say that we've explained it biologically is nonsense. We haven't explained it biologically. The idea that we can disprove biologically the existence of the soul just isn't true. It's a faith. That is, Steve Pinker has faith that we don't have a soul. He just can't call it that because he doesn't believe in faith.
Pharmaceuticals and using the brain scans
There isn't a close connection between brain scans and pharmaceuticals. That is, brain scans, it's a very complicated issue, and one, by the way, that I'm not an expert in. But brain scans are not the best way to determine pharmaceutical effectiveness or pharmaceutical need. So brain imaging and pharmaceuticals are not natural bedfellows, right? There are other ways to determine. Blood chemistry is a much better way to determine, when we want to know the percentage of or whether someone has something like a serotonin deficiency, we can't use a brain scan to determine that, right? So it's not really brain scans and pharmaceuticals that have a lot of connections. That's not entirely true. There are some examples I could give you where they do have a connection, but that's not the natural pairing.
One example is there's a drug that's in the news right now that's Levantrin for female libido, and I'm just kind of curious if that registers in brain scans, or if you know anything about that.
Yeah, I don't know that they've ever, So here's the interesting thing. I'll tell you the interesting thing about brain scanning that always fascinates me, and I've said this in the press, and neuromarketers don't like me because of it. So they do these and I'm going to take a little detour to get back to your question. So neuromarketing is this new field where they put people in scanners and they try to ask them questions and find out things about products. So they like stick you in a scanner and ask you whether you like Coke or Pepsi, or they show you pictures and look at your brain. And so they want to know if you like this packaging, they want to know if you like this cookie, whatever it is. The problem is that they have not yet proven that there is a strong correlation between what they find and actual behavior. And in fact, it probably is a lot cheaper and a lot more accurate to ask you if you like the cookie. Right? And very often they find things that are kind of really obvious, like they put people in brain scanners, they put Democrats and Republicans in brain scanners and ask them about Bush and another candidate back when Bush was president. And, they discovered shockingly that people who were for Bush were much more likely to like Bush, right? And were much more likely to excuse Bush when he said things that were problematic and attack the other candidate when they said things that were problematic and they didn't like him as much. And I mean, they said that much more fancy than that, but that's what it really boiled down to. So here's a perfect example. I am sure that they're going to give that drug to women, stick them in brain scanners, and look for signs of excitation, okay? What we have found, though, is that though there is correlation between brain states and subjective reports of behavior, there's not one-to-one connection. So we can see people who their brains seem to be telling us that they feel a certain way or engage a certain way or are angry or whatever it is, and the person will report, no, I don't feel that at all. We don't get how the brain works. The human brain, listen to this, the human brain is the single most complex thing we know about in the universe. Think about that. There is nothing we have discovered in the entire universe as complex as the human brain. It has trillions of connections, made into these structures that we don't really understand. We can look at them and see whether, all that we know about this, or not all, but a lot that we know about this is whether that structure lights up when you do this. And what does light up mean? It doesn't light up. What light up means is we do a scan to look at blood flow to particular parts of the brain, and we want to see where is there a little bit more blood flow when you engage in this activity. That means to us that that part of the brain is working harder because it's taking up more oxygen. And therefore, we say you're using that part of the brain when you are doing this. And that's our brilliant strategy for understanding the brain. That's where all of the studies I showed you came from that basic premise. And so, yeah, we might do a study. We might give that to women to see if the part of their brain that seems to indicate sexual excitation is lit up when they take this. But, it might make a lot more sense to ask the woman if she's become stimulated.
So, long married couples want an answer to this question, short of a court order. How do I keep my wife from sucking my thoughts when we're sitting in the same room together? I know that happens a lot. I've heard the phenomenon described a lot from other people. Right. What's behind that?
Right. So, I'm going to answer your question more seriously than you meant it.
No, I meant it.
Of course, the obvious answer is nothing can stop your wife from sucking your thoughts out of your brain. This is, my wife does it to me too. But here's a really interesting thing about that. So I'm very, very much against the court being able to order someone to get a lie detection brain scan. But there is a real problem with that. People who argue against me. There's a guy named Paul Ekman, who is a psychologist, and he developed, he discovered, very interesting actually. So if I put you in front of a picture of people talking, of a television screen of people talking, some of whom are telling the truth and some of whom are lying, over and over again, studies have shown that people cannot tell. They do about 50-50. We think we can tell when people are lying. There are certain gives that certain people might have, but on average, we're actually really bad at it, at telling when people are lying. Except there are certain people who are really good at it. The problem is they can't tell you why. They can say, she's lying. Well, how do you know? I just look at her and I can tell she's lying. And they end up being right like 70% of the time or something like that. So Ekman decided he was going to figure out why these people could tell. And what he discovered is what he calls micro-expressions. And this isn't just sort of popular science. He was at Columbia, a very serious researcher, and now does this. He trains police departments and intelligence agencies all over the world. It turns out that our faces engage in these micro-expressions. They're just a few milliseconds long. And when people lie, the majority of people actually all have a tell in their face through this micro-expression that flits across their face in just a few milliseconds. And some people have figured out how to detect that without knowing that they're actually detecting it, because it's almost out of consciousness, it's so fast. But when you slow faces down, lots of people can do it. So if you train someone how to do it, and then if especially you slow the film down, you go, aha, there's the tell, right? And then he trains people how to do it more quickly. Well, here's the thing. He does it about lie detection. But in fact, we have all kinds of micro-expressions that flit across our face, not just about lie detection. And I think what happens is that after 30 years of living with someone, you get to know their micro-expressions. And that's why she's sucking thoughts out of your head.
All right, I can see that the audience is riveted, and they could probably stay here and ask you questions for another hour. And I know everyone's going to go sign up for a neuroethics course if they can find one. But we're going to draw this to a close. I think there will be an opportunity to maybe ask a few questions in person here down at the front. But please join me in thanking Dr. Wolpe. And we are adjourned.
Hey.
It was terrific.
Oh, good.
Kids loved it too. We talked about Descartes and fMRIs on the way here.
Oh, great.
Loved it.
Good.
Out of the park.
Thanks.
It's food for thought. Could I have your card, sir?
There is a neuroethics course.
I have.
Here?
They're in my bag over here.
I'd like to write to you if you don't.
Thanks.